This is a continuation of our class presentation from March 13th. And the last question we did during our class presentation was a review of question number 11. So let's go on now and review question number 12. Which of the following statements about risks associated with sampling is correct? And again, you're given your four choices. Go ahead, stop the video. When you have made your choice, go ahead and restart the video. The answer to question number 12, which of the following statements about risks associated with sampling is correct? And the answer is A. Non-sampling risk can arise because an auditor failed to recognize misstatements. And if we take a look at, let's take a look at B, C, and D. B says non-sampling risk arises from the possibility that when a substantive test is restricted to a sample, conclusions might be different than if the auditor had tested each item in the population. Actually, that is the definition of sampling risk, or in effect the definition of the confidence level which is related to sampling risk, and that would be encountered under sampling. The sampling process is its sampling risk itself, not non-sampling. Okay, the answer then to C, sampling risk includes a possibility of selecting audit procedures that are not appropriate to achieve the audit, the specific objectives. And that actually is a definition of part of a definition of non-sampling risk. Then we take a look at D. D, sampling risk is derived from the uncertainty in applying audit procedures to specific risks. And again, that would be part of the definition of non-sampling risk. So the only item that could be right, and it is correct, is non-sampling risk can arise because an auditor failed to recognize misstatements. In other words, the auditor performed the sampling processes with no trouble at all, except they made some type of procedural or conceptual error in terms of recognizing the misstatements. So with that, let's go and take a look at question number 13. Which of the following factors are considered in determining the sample size for a test of controls? Again, go ahead and arrive at your answer, stop your video, and when you are ready, restart the video and review the answer slide. Okay, let's take a look at the answer to number 13. Which of the following factors are considered in determining the sample size for a test control? And that includes, in this case, the expected deviation rate, that is correct, and the tolerable deviation rate, that is also included. And as you can see here, we're utilizing the table for determining a sample size, and you can see it requires the tolerable deviation rate and the expected deviation rate in order to come up with an appropriate sample. Okay, let's take a look at number 14. Which of the following statements is correct concerning statistical sampling in tests of controls? And again, go ahead and stop your video, and when you're ready, restart it again for the answer to question 14. Okay, let's take a look at the answer to question 14. Which of the following statements is correct concerning statistical sampling in tests of controls? And the answer in this case is D. There is an inverse relationship between the sample size and the tolerable rate of deviation. And if we take a look at A, it says deviations from control procedures at a given rate usually result in misstatements at a higher rate. Okay, the truth is with A, deviations do not necessarily result in misstatements at a higher rate. Sorry about that. B, as the population size doubles, the sample size should also double. And that is actually not true. As a matter of fact, proportionately, the sample size will become a smaller portion of the population. And C, the qualitative aspects of deviation are not considered by the auditor. And as we've talked about in the presentation, that's entirely not true. The auditor always reviews the qualitative aspects of every deviation in the sample because that may reveal even a bigger problem than simply something not being representative of the total population. And again, what we can see here is that with the tolerable deviation or the error, the exception rate, as that rate increases, or as the auditors decides to increase that rate, that means the sample size itself will actually go down. If the auditor decreases the tolerable deviation rate, the sample size will go up. Let's try question number 15. When testing a control procedure, the auditor finds that one voucher in the sample selection is voided. The voucher ordinarily should be replaced by another voucher in the random sample if the following voucher constitutes one of these four conditions. So again, stop your video, and when you're ready, restart the video to review the answer. Okay, the answer to number 15. When testing a control procedure, the auditor finds that one voucher in the sample selection is voided. The voucher ordinarily should be replaced by another voucher in the random sample if the voucher B has been properly voided. And here's the reasoning behind that. Okay, we are testing vouchers. A voided voucher is if the voucher never occurred, because we're actually looking at the voucher, at the valid voucher, unless for some reason we had defined the voided vouchers as being part of our population. Now, if we take a look at the individual answers, A constitutes a deviation. Okay, a voided voucher does not necessarily constitute a deviation unless it was defined as a deviation for testing purposes, and that was what we said in this little bubble description. C, the voucher cannot be located. Okay, now if that's the case, the auditor must obtain reasonable assurance that the misplaced voucher has actually been voided, in other words, was not part of the valid vouchers. D represents an immaterial dollar amount. Okay, D, the level of materiality has no bearing on the sample selection regarding controls. The control is either working or it's not working. Let's take a look now at number 16. In determining the number of documents to select to obtain assurance that all sales returns have been properly authorized, the auditor should consider the tolerable rate of deviation from the control activity. That's one factor. The auditor should also consider the expected rate of deviation and or the allowable risk allowable risk of under-reliance, or neither of the above. So again, stop your video, and when you're ready, restart the video to review the answer. Okay, and let's take a look at the answer to number 16 here. And in determining the number of documents to select to obtain assurance that all sales returns have been properly authorized, the auditor should consider the tolerable rate of deviation from the control activity. The auditor should also consider, and in this case, the expected rate of deviations, not the allowable risk of under-reliance. Now, if you will remember from our previous presentation, the factors required to determine sample size in an attribute sampling plan include, number one, the tolerable deviation rate. In other words, what is the rate that the auditor is willing to accept, and anything above that means a control failed. Okay, number two, the acceptable risk of over-reliance. In other words, what we call the confidence level, and that's where the auditor concludes controls. This is the risk would be basically it concludes controls are effective when the controls are actually not effective, and that's a case when we have sampling risk where the sample is not representative of the total population. Now, if number two said the acceptable risk of over-reliance, we would include number one and number two, but in this case it's only number one. Then number three is the expected deviation rate, and again that's based upon the auditor's experience or professional judgment. So that's the answer to number 16. Let's take a look at number 17. A rather wordy question. What is the auditor's evaluation of a statistical sample for attributes when a test of 50 documents results in 3 deviations? In other words, 3 exceptions out of 50 sampled. The tolerable rate, or in effect, the tolerable rate of error is 7%. The expected population deviation rate, and that was set by the auditor, is 5%. And the allowance for sampling risk is set at 2%. So you're given 4 different statements. You have to pick the statement that is the most correct. And again, go ahead and stop the video, review your statements, and when you're ready, take a look at the answer then to start the video and take a look at the answer to number 17. Okay, let's take a look at the answer to number 17. What is the auditor's evaluation of a statistical sample for attributes when a test of 50 documents results in 3 deviations? The tolerable rate is 7%. The expected population deviation rate is 5%, and the allowance for sampling risk is 2%. In other words, plus or minus 2%. Remember, the allowance for sampling risk is not the same thing which is the sampling risk. Sampling risk is where the risk that the sample will not represent the total population. Sampling risk is also called confidence level in the statistical tables. The allowance for sampling risk basically says the results of your sample should be plus or within, in this case, plus or minus 2% of the error rate that you calculated. So in this case, the answer is D, modify the assessed risk of material misstatement because the sample deviation rate plus the allowance for sampling risk exceeds the tolerable deviation rate. Now let's look into what we're saying here. The sample as calculated results in a 6% exception, or if you will, deviation rate, because that's equal to 3 exceptions divided by the sample size of 50. However, that doesn't tell the whole story because that's what we calculated. We also set the sample size to be able to assess that the allowance for sampling risk, in other words, the deviation from our calculated rate, would be plus or minus 2% of that rate. So the calculated 6% deviation rate plus or minus the allowance for sampling risk indicates the deviation in the population is going to be between 4% and 8%. In other words, 6% plus 2% or minus 2%. In this case, the upper portion of the rate, the 8% exceeds the tolerable rate. Therefore, the auditor would consider this to be a control failure. And then the auditor is going to have to modify the assessed risk of material misstatement accordingly because of the loss or the failure of this control, and increase substantive testing that is going to test the potential material misstatements or the misstatements that would result as a failure, assuming that control has failed. Okay, let's go on to question number 18. Number 18, the auditor designed a statistical sample that would provide a 1% risk of over-reliance for the test of a key control. The tolerable deviation rate was established at 7%. From previous experience with this client, the auditor estimated that actually 2.5% of the population would most likely contain exceptions. A sample of 200 invoices was examined and 7 deviations were noted by the auditor. Based upon the results, the auditor determined the achieved upper deviation limit was 8%. Now let's go ahead then, and when you have a chance, stop the video, and when you're ready to review the answer to 18, go ahead and restart your video. Okay, let's take a look at the answer to number 18. The auditor designed a statistical sample that would provide a 1% risk of over-reliance for the test of a key control. The tolerable deviation rate was established at 7%. From previous experience, the auditor estimated that 2.5% of the population would contain deviations. A sample of 200 invoices was examined and 7 deviations were noted. Based upon the results, the auditor determined the upper deviation limit to be 8%. In the evaluation of the sample, the auditor decided to increase the level of the assessment of risk of material misstatement because, and the answer in this case is A, the tolerable deviation rate of 7%. That's as much as the auditor could say that's the upper level. Anything above that, the control failed. So the tolerable deviation rate of 7% was less than the achieved upper deviation rate of 8%. And I explained that in the text here at the bottom. Okay, let's take a look now at question number 19. In assessing sampling risk, the risk of incorrect rejection and the risk of assessing control risk too high relate to, again, you're given your 4 choices. Analyze your choices, stop the video, and when you're ready, restart the video. Okay, the answer to number 19. In assessing sampling risk, the risk of incorrect rejection and the risk of assessing control risk too high relate to the A, efficiency of the audit. So let's go back and take a look at a portion of the presentation from our class presentation. Again, we can talk about control risk and in terms of attribute sample and incorrect acceptance and rejections in variable sampling. But in the case of attribute sampling, if we assess control risk too high, that means the derived sample exception rate itself is higher than the true deviation, or if you will, exception rate of the total population. That means that's going to result in an increase in the auditor's substantive testing to test the risk resulting from that control. So in that case, what will happen is it's going to require the auditor to do more work when the auditor really doesn't have to do any more work. So it decreases it impacts the efficiency of the audit negatively. If we take a look at variable sampling, we talk about the risk of incorrect rejection. Under incorrect rejection, The derived sample results indicate the balance is misstated when the balance of the true population is not misstated. So again, if that's the case, the auditors are going to likely have to increase substantive testing to verify whether or not that particular valuation, that sample is accurate to mitigate that particular risk when it really doesn't need to be. The substantive testing doesn't need to be increased in that area. So again, that's going to result in additional substantive testing that is not needed, and therefore it's going to adversely impact the efficiency of the audit. Okay, let's go on to question number 20, which is the last question for our sampling set. Number 20, the risk of incorrect acceptance and the likelihood of assessing control risk too low relate to the, and again we're given 4 different choices. Go ahead, stop the video, and when you are ready, go ahead and restart your video. Okay, let's take a look at the answer to question number 20. The risk of incorrect acceptance and the likelihood of assessing control risk too low relate to the D, the effectiveness of the audits. Again, we can take a look at our portion of our presentation regarding assessing risks, regarding attribute sampling and variable sampling. And if we assess control risk too low, that means that particular audit sampling error would result in a derived sample exception rate that is less than the true deviation rate of the total population. So that can lead the auditor to concluding a control is effective when actually, in fact, the control is not effective. In the case of risk of incorrect acceptance, that means the derived sample results indicate the balance is not misstated when in fact in the true population it is misstated. So again, there's a possibility of the auditor concluding a balance is acceptable when the population in fact is resulting in a true population is resulting in a value that is misstated. So the answer in this case would be D. And that is the end of this continuation video on sampling. Thank you for your time.